stood there staring directly at the man who came prepared to humiliate him in front of everyone. The crowd expected a reaction, a sharp word, maybe even anger. But Bruce Lee didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't defend himself. That silence should have felt like weakness, but instead, it grew heavier with every passing second. The challenger's confidence started to crack, his voice losing strength as the room turned tense, almost suffocating. Because in that moment, Bruce Lee's silence wasn't emptiness. It was control. And somehow everyone there realized the same chilling truth at once. When a man like him chooses not to speak, it means he's already said everything without a single word. Everyone in the room had already decided how the moment would go. The tension was not new, but the expectation was sharp, almost scripted in their minds. A confrontation was supposed to explode, words were supposed to fly, pride was supposed to clash until one side broke. The challenger stood with that exact belief, his confidence built on the assumption that silence could never be stronger than speech. But when Bruce Lee stood there without reacting, something unexpected began to shift in the atmosphere. It was not calm in the peaceful sense, but heavy, like the air itself had slowed down and was watching. He didn't move forward, he didn't step back, and he didn't offer even the smallest reaction that people usually rely on to measure weakness or strength. The absence of response became more noticeable than any shout could have been. The challenger tried again, pushing words harder, trying to force a reaction as if silence was just another wall that could be broken if enough pressure was applied. But that silence did not crack. Instead, it expanded, filling every corner of the room, turning the attention of everyone present inward, making them aware of their own breathing, their own uncertainty, their own discomfort. People who had come expecting entertainment started to feel something else entirely. It was no longer about who would win a verbal exchange, because there was none happening. It became about control, about presence, about who was truly steering the moment without moving a finger. The challenger's voice began to sound less certain, not because he was losing arguments, but because arguments themselves were dissolving into emptiness. The silence was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and strangely dominant in a way that made even confident observers rethink what strength actually looked like in real time. The more the silence stretched, the more it reshaped the perception of everyone watching. What seemed like inaction was actually pressure, the kind that builds without visible force. Eyes shifted between the two men, waiting for something to break, but nothing did. The challenger began to realize that there was no easy way to win against someone who refused to play the expected game. And in that realization, hesitation started to creep into his stance, subtle but visible to those paying attention closely enough. In contrast, the silence carried a strange kind of authority, as if every second without a response was rewriting the rules of engagement. It wasn't just about refusing to speak. It was about refusing to be pulled into a frame where speech was required. That refusal changed everything about how the moment was being interpreted by the crowd, who slowly began to understand that control is not always about action, but sometimes about withholding it completely. The room, once filled with anticipation of noise and confrontation, now felt strangely suspended, as if time itself had lost its usual direction. Every small movement seemed amplified against the weight of that silence, and every expectation that had been built up before the moment now felt fragile and uncertain. The challenger tried to reassert himself, but even his posture began to betray a shift that words could not fix. The audience, once ready to react instantly to any escalation, now waited differently, more carefully, as though they were witnessing something they did not fully understand yet. And through it all, Bruce Lee remained still, not offering resolution, not offering comfort, not offering any signal that the moment was reaching closure, because what was unfolding was still changing shape in ways no one could fully define. As the silence continued to grow and press deeper into everyone's awareness, as the challenger had entered the moment with a voice full of certainty, as if volume alone could define victory, as if repetition could replace control, and as if confidence, displayed outwardly, would automatically translate into dominance over the situation. Every word he spoke was meant to pull attention toward himself, to frame the encounter in a way where he would always appear in charge, always appear superior, always appear unshakable in front of those watching closely. But what he did not anticipate was that the real shift was not happening in his speech, but in the space between his words. Where silence was beginning to respond in a way he could not control, Bruce Lee remained still. Not reacting in the way the challenger expected, not feeding the rhythm of confrontation, not offering the resistance that would allow the situation to escalate in a familiar pattern. That absence of reaction created something unusual because it forced the energy of the room to stop flowing in one direction and start folding back on itself. People who had been focused on the challenger began to shift their attention without realizing it, drawn toward the quiet presence that refused to engage on the expected terms. The challenger misread that silence at first. To him, it looked like hesitation, like uncertainty, like an opening that could be exploited with more pressure, more words, more forceful presence. So he increased his intensity, stepping further into his confidence, pushing his voice louder, as if volume could break through what discipline had already sealed. But instead of breaking anything, his escalation only made the contrast sharper. The silence did not shrink under pressure. It expanded, as if every aggressive word added weight to something invisible that was already dominating the atmosphere. Observers in the room began to feel an uncomfortable realization forming without discussion. The situation was no longer about who was speaking more, but about who was actually shaping the moment. The challenger was speaking into resistance, while the silence was shaping perception itself. The mind naturally expects reaction, expects push and pull, expects escalation to lead to resolution. But here there was no such cycle completing itself, only an ongoing imbalance that kept growing in intensity without resolution. The challenger's confidence, which had seemed solid in the beginning, started to reveal small fractures that were not visible in his words but in the pauses between them. Each time he paused, expecting interruption or acknowledgement, none came. And those missing responses began to affect every passing second in that room felt heavier than the last. Not because anything louder was happening, but because nothing was changing in the way people expected it to change. The challenger had entered with momentum, with the belief that escalation naturally forces outcomes, that persistence guarantees dominance, and that if one keeps pushing long enough, the other side must eventually respond. But what he failed to understand was that silence, when controlled, does not behave like absence. It behaves like pressure that accumulates without visible movement. Bruce Lee stood in that same position, calm and unmoved, and the lack of reaction was no longer something the challenger could simply interpret as weakness. At first it had felt like an opportunity, then it became a test, and now it was turning into something far less comfortable to define. Every word spoken by the challenger now seemed to land differently, not because the words had changed, but because the environment around them had shifted in tone. The room itself felt like it was no longer participating in his confidence. The audience, once eager to witness a verbal clash, began to experience a subtle but growing discomfort. They had expected a rhythm, attack and response, statement and counterstatement, escalation followed by resolution, but that rhythm never formed. Instead, there was only one side continuing to push forward, and the other remaining completely still, not resisting in an obvious way, but also not validating anything that was being thrown toward it. That absence of validation created a strange imbalance, as if the challenger was speaking into something that was absorbing rather than reacting. With each attempt to provoke a response, the challenger found himself unintentionally revealing more about his own dependence on reaction. His confidence, which had initially looked solid and structured, began to appear increasingly reliant on external feedback. Without interruption, without resistance, without even acknowledgement, his words started to lose their natural flow. He began to adjust his tone repeatedly, searching for some invisible trigger point that would finally bring the silence to an end. But the silence did not behave like a barrier that could be broken. It behaved more like a field that expanded in response to pressure. The more force was applied, the more noticeable it became. And in that expanding silence, perception began to shift in ways that were not immediately verbalized but were clearly felt. People started to notice that attention was no longer anchored to the challenger's speech alone, But to the contrast between speech and stillness itself, there was something deeply unsettling about how unchanged the still figure of Bruce Lee remained throughout it all. Not because silence is unusual, but because in confrontational situations, silence is rarely sustained without purpose. That sustained stillness began to carry its own weight, not as emptiness, but as presence without permission, presence without dependency on reaction. The challenger's pacing began to shift. What had started as controlled delivery slowly turned into something more irregular, with small variations in speed and emphasis that betrayed a growing need to regain psychological ground. Each pause he took, instead of creating anticipation in others, now created reflection in himself. In those brief moments of no response, he was forced to confront the fact that his words were not being absorbed in the way he intended, but were, instead, being met with complete non-engagement. That non-engagement began to alter the way the room felt. Silence stopped being something passive in the background and started functioning like an active force shaping interpretation. Even minor sounds like shifting weight or controlled breathing began to feel amplified, because they were no longer competing with dialogue, but existing against a backdrop of absolute refusal to react. The challenger tried again to push the situation forward, increasing intensity, tightening his stance, attempting to re-establish dominance through presence and voice. But each attempt seemed to lose efficiency, as if the environment itself was no longer aligned with his intent. The confidence that once felt outwardly projected now started turning inward in small disruptions, not visible as collapse, but noticeable as friction within his own control. And through all of this, the silence continued to expand in meaning rather than in sound, becoming less about what was not being said, and more about what was no longer being successfully reached, as if every attempt to penetrate it only confirmed its stability, and the more it held, the more the entire interaction began to tilt towards something that could no longer be measured by volume or repetition or force alone as the moment continued stretching further into a space. What everyone thought would decide the moment was words, but what actually decided, it was the absence of them. The challenger had arrived with a mindset built on expression, assuming that dominance is proven through speech, that control is maintained through continuous assertion, and that silence is nothing more than a gap waiting to be filled. But standing in front of him, unmoved and unreadable, Bruce Lee turned that assumption upside down without ever needing to challenge it directly. At first, the silence looked like something passive, something that could be pushed against until it broke. The challenger continued speaking, trying to shape the situation through force of personality, but every word he released seemed to lose its expected effect. Normally, speech creates direction. It pulls attention forward. It builds momentum between speaker and listener, but here, that natural flow was disrupted. His words did not bounce back in resistance, nor did they receive acknowledgement that could validate their weight. They simply entered the space and dissolved into it. This created a strange psychological imbalance. The challenger began to feel as though he was the only one participating in the exchange, even though others were clearly watching. That realization does not arrive as a thought at first, but as a subtle disruption in confidence, a hesitation that appears between sentences, a slight tightening in delivery that was not there in the beginning. Without feedback, even confident, expression begins to question its own direction. The silence, however, was not empty. It was structured in a way that made it feel like presence without movement. The stillness of Bruce Lee was not accidental or uncertain. It carried the weight of intentional restraint. That restraint changed how the challenger's speech was being processed by everyone watching. Instead of focusing on the content of what was being said, attention slowly shifted toward the contrast between effort and stillness. People in the room began to notice that energy was no longer flowing evenly. One side was actively projecting, while the other side was not participating in projection at all. That imbalance created a tension that could not be resolved through escalation alone. The challenger increased intensity, believing that stronger expression would eventually force reaction. But instead, each increase only made the silence more noticeable, as if pressure was not breaking it, but defining its shape more clearly. The audience, once expectant and reactive in their own anticipation, started to feel the shift internally. Silence in a normal context is neutral, but silence in confrontation becomes interpretive. Everyone began to project meaning onto it, trying to understand what it represented. Was it confidence, control, disinterest, or something deeper that could not be easily categorized? That uncertainty created a shared psychological space where interpretation replaced reaction. The challenger, meanwhile, began to lose the comfort of predictability. In any verbal exchange, there is usually a rhythm that allows participants to anticipate timing, interruption, or response. But here, that rhythm never formed. Every time he paused, expecting interruption or acknowledgement, there was only continuation of stillness. That absence of expected structure began to affect his internal pacing, making his speech slightly more forceful, slightly more urgent, slightly less controlled than before. Even his own voice started to feel different to him, as if it was no longer anchored by interaction but floating in a space where feedback had been removed. That is where pressure begins to change form. It is no longer about what is being said, but about what is not being returned. The mind naturally seeks confirmation in dialogue, and when that confirmation is absent, even certainty begins to feel unstable. In contrast, the silence held its own kind of authority. Not aggressive, not reactive, but consistent. The stillness of Bruce Lee became the fixed point around which everything else seemed to move unevenly. The challenger's words became motion without resistance, while the silence became resistance without motion. That inversion changed how control was being perceived by everyone present. The more the challenger tried to assert himself, the more he began to feel that control was not something being taken away, but something that was simply not being engaged with. And that lack of engagement created a space where confidence had nothing to attach itself to, where assertion had no reflection, where escalation had no counterpart to complete its cycle. In that unfinished cycle, the atmosphere itself began to feel suspended, as if the moment was no longer progressing toward confrontation or resolution, but instead stretching into a state where expectation had nowhere left to land, and silence continued to define the structure of everything unfolding without ever needing to announce its presence directly, as the situation remained unresolved in a way that continued to expand beyond the limits of what speech alone could influence or contain.